Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weep Union, and in this one there are several developments in the Donetsk region in favor of the Russians. The Russians managed to advance in the northern flank of Toretsk, to the east of Pokrovsk, and to the southwest of the city. The Russians attempted an advance in the direction of Serebryanka, the town just northeast of Siversk. They managed to advance within the town. However, they were not able to establish a foothold. Starting out in the south, the Russians managed to advance to the west of Vesele, gaining control over several parts of the fortified positions, which is the defensive line of the Ukrainians here in the border area between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions. The Russians are here moving westwards to gain control over the fortified position, flanking Shevchenko from the north. In addition to their positions to the south and to the east of the town, they'll be able to squish them out in a western direction to push out the Ukrainian forces, while also gaining control over the fortified position to the north of it, gaining control over favorable positions for future offensive operations. We see the border area between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk region in this direction is separated by the Vovcha River line going through the northwestern flank of these positions. There are also some heavily forested areas. The Ukrainians here have an additional defensive line, not in terms of fortification but geographical advantages. However, this is also a geographical disadvantage for launching counterattacks on Russian positions and creating a large concentration of forces in the area. Therefore, the Russians have the advantage now that they have bypassed the defensive line and are flanking it from the north and from the east. The Russian objective here is to gain control over the border area between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk region, all the way up to the forested and river line areas, establishing themselves with a defensive line and not entering into Ukrainian territory yet. Instead, the focus will be in the direction of Novopavlivka and potentially to the south of these geographical barriers. While moving through the main highway across the border area and across the river line will take place in coordination with Russian forces following the capture of Novopavlivka, moving through Ivanivka in the north onwards towards Pithavrylivka. Moving on to the eastern flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians made a small advance within Mirne. From this we can see the Russians continue offensive operations west of Melenivka in the direction of Mykolaiivka and Novoekonomishne. The likely offensive operations can control the remaining fortified positions and establish themselves on the eastern flank of this defensive line. In the northern flank of Toretsk, there has been two separate advances by the Russians, both alongside the canal, where the Russians made a significant amount of advances, gained control over several fortified positions, and reaching the outskirts of Bilahora at the same time as they are at the outskirts of Dilivka. The Russians here are slowly moving alongside the canal to improve their positions in the area, widening their control alongside the canal itself, and now very close to connecting their forces between the Chasiv Yar direction and the Toretsk direction. At the same time, they are looking to establish their positions here near Belora and Dilivka. The objective is to gain control of them, to have a secure flank to connect their forces between Chasiv Yar and Toretsk. The Russian objective here is to launch a combined offensive to the southeast of Kasyantinivka with their forces in the Chasiv Yar direction. However, the Chasiv Yar direction has a very difficult time supplying their forces. This means more crossings across the canal, and with a connection with the Toretsk and Orlivka direction to the south, the Russians would be able to significantly bolster the supplies of their forces in the Chasiv Yar direction and allow the Russians to have several rapid advances, similar to the northern flank of Toretsk in the Chasiv Yar direction, where they will look to gain control of all of the positions necessary for the operational encirclement of Kasyantinivka. The Russian supply issue in the Chasiv Yar direction stems from the fact that they have few crossings available. All of the crossings is between the northern flank of Chasiv Yar to the southeast of Stepushki, where every single one of these are under constant reconnaissance by Ukrainian drones operating from Kasyantinivka, which is an important position for the activation and utilization of FPV drones for the Ukrainian forces in the area. At the same time, the Russians had issues gaining control over the apartment complex area, which lasted a long time. Now the Russians have established control over the apartment complex area, allowing for the forces that cross over to establish themselves within the frontline positions and have the cover of this building to entrench themselves and build up their forces for additional offensive operations to the outskirts of the city. The Russians have managed to advance in the northern flank and along the canal. Here they are also attempting to widen the crossings by gaining control of additional ones to the south of Ryorivka and generally on the northern flank of Chasiv Yar, while at the same time they're pushing westwards to have additional positions to establish themselves within. However, it is difficult to push westwards when you lack supplies. That is why the direct connection of Orlivka towards Chasiv Yar on the western bank of the canal will allow the Russians to significantly bolster their forces across the canal and allow them to start storming towns such as Predetyene, the rest of Supushki, Mykolaivka, Chervone, Podolsky, and generally the towns and settlements and fortified positions on the western flank of Chasiv Yar. This will allow the Russians to secure their positions within Chasiv Yar, set up firing positions, FPV drone out operators, artillery positions to bombard the city of Kashantinivka and improve their positions for additional offensive operations north of Chasiv Yar. Chasiv Yar is not just the gateway for the operational siege of Kashantinivka, but it is also the gateway for gaining control over the high ground east and south of Kramatorsk and Slovyansk, allowing the Russians to set up positions on the high ground overlooking these settlements to heavily demolish them during any siege over these positions. Both of these cities are heavy fortresses, and the Russians have not been able to touch them since they lost Izium back in 2022. The Ukrainians managed to secure the northern flank of Slovyansk, and following the loss of Liman as well, the Russians were completely kicked away from the city. Now that the Russians are with control over Bakhmut and the majority of Chasiv Yar, they are threatening the southern flank of this defensive line, the Slovyansk-Kashantinivka line, with an operational encirclement of the city. This can expand to include Kramatorsk and Slovyansk as well. The Russians can break through the defensive line connecting Troshkivka with Pokrovsk and advance towards the rear of these positions as well. However, that is for a long-term offensive going into the end of this year, while the current situation is already very close to an operational encirclement of Kashantinivka. The capture of Siversk and the consolidation of their positions in the Chasiv Yar direction will allow the Russians to gain control over everything south of Liman and east of the Slovyansk-Kashantinivka line. The Russians also managed to advance further to the west in the direction of Delivka, gaining control over the town and some of the fortified positions and advancing along the railway itself. The Russians are here slowly moving towards Oleksandro-Shultine, where the Russians are looking to gain control over these three settlements of Delivka, Bilahora, and Oleksandro-Shultine. This will allow them to pressure Predetyene and Stupushki, gaining control over those as well, will allow the Russians to establish themselves on the eastern and southeastern flanks of Kashantinivka. This also allowed the Russians to have several supply lines connecting their forces in the north and the south. It will also increase the pressure on the operationally encircled forces of the Ukrainians to the west of Toretsk. Further north in the direction of Serebryanka, the Russians launched an offensive push west of Ryorivka, where they managed to gain a foothold within Serebryanka. However, a Ukrainian counterattack managed to push them out, leaving no foothold or established positions by the Russians within the town. This geolocated footage here confirms the Russian presence within it, following which the Ukrainians launched a counterattack. Based on this, we see that the closer the Russians gain to Siversk, the more difficult it becomes for them to take control of these positions. However, Serebryanka is also the final town that is between the Russian forces and Siversk. There's the tiny settlement of Novoselivka, which cannot be considered a town. It is just a forest line, really. So with this, the Russians are looking to gain control over Serebryanka as the final settlement here east of Siversk, following which the battle over Siversk itself will begin from the southern, eastern, and northern flanks. And again, gaining control over Siversk itself will open the way for the Russian forces to gain control over everything east of the Slovyansk-Kashantinivka line and south of Liman. It will allow the Russians to launch offensive operations on the Serbyansky forest area from the northern and southern flanks to encircle the Ukrainian forces within it, and will allow the Russians to significantly bolster their positions here in the northern parts of the Donetsk region. Therefore, we can see that the offensive operations by the Russians right now has one clear objective, and that is to establish the best possible positions for a siege over Liman, Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, Kashantinivka, and the remaining parts of the fortified positions within the Donetsk region for the fall season, where the roads will be extremely important because the fields will be muddy from the rain, and this makes it very difficult for Ukrainian forces to supply themselves outside of these roads. With constant Russian reconnaissance and strikes on the supply lines of the Ukrainians, the siege can become very tough. While the Russians have the same issue with Ukrainian forces attacking Russian supply lines, the Russians will be the ones who have improved their positions ahead of the fall period. And with these positions, they would not need to move too much. Instead, they will just need to strike the Ukrainian positions. And with those strikes on Ukrainian positions located on the low ground, with Russians having control of the high ground, the Russians would eventually gain control over this defensive line for full control over the Donetsk region by the end of the year. And as we can see with the old fortification lines, we can see that the main defensive positions of the Ukrainians are centered around the northern and southern border areas between Russia and Ukraine. It has slightly expanded to cover for the advances of the Russians. However, these new fortifications are completely incomparable to the ones in the Donetsk region. The ones in the Donetsk region were built for over 10 years. The ones in other sections of the front line have been built for a year or two, and this has been done with a lot of corruption. We all remember the piles of dragon teeth which we saw in the Kharkiv direction, which allowed for rapid advances by the Russian forces during the Kharkiv offensive in 2024. At the same time, we also see that across the border into the Sumy region, the Russians have not met much resistance due to fortifications, and this confirms that these new fortifications are completely incomparable to the ones built prior to the Russian invasion in 2022, and therefore, once the Russians go beyond that of the Donetsk region, the Ukrainians would have a much more difficult time defending their positions, not to mention the geographical advantages the Ukrainians have in the Donetsk region with the large urban areas, industrial zones, and dense forest areas, which are not present in regions such as the Dnipro region, the southern parts of the Kharkiv region, the Poltava region, which are much more exposed, flatter, and open compared to other sections of the front line, which means a collapse of the Donetsk region for the Ukrainian forces could lead to a collapse of other sections of the front line by the Russians bypassing fortified positions and attacking them from the rear. The Russians would rather storm Poltava through the Donetsk region than storm Kharkiv city through the border area, as the Russians would have the ability to completely cut off the supplies to Kharkiv, and at the same time the Ukrainians do not have any significant fortifications within the city, and we can see that the Russians would have a significantly larger advantage in doing so compared to attacking Kharkiv head-on. So from that we can see that any attempt by the Russians to go beyond the 4 regions that they have annexed in southern Ukraine, they would be looking to gain control over the eastern bank of the Dnieper River by bypassing the border areas and going in between these cities to target the center of the supply hubs and to isolate these frontline positions. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.